Kia ora, and welcome to the Informed Futures podcast. I'm Anne Bardsley from KOI2, the Center for Informed Futures. We're a think tank at Waipapa Taumaterau, the University of Auckland, and we address a range of complex issues challenging our future. We come from the world of science and evidence for policymaking, but more recently, we've been researching, developing, and experimenting with processes grounded in the principles of deliberative democracy and democratic innovation to engage the public more deeply in the tough decisions that are going to need to be made. Today, my guest is Distinguished Professor John Gastil. He's from the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences and the Department of Political Science in the School of Public Policy at Penn State University in the United States. He's one of the world's leading deliberative democracy scholars and innovators, and he's been here in Auckland this week, generously sharing his knowledge. As I said, we've been working on deliberative democracy approaches here at KOI2, both looking at the theoretical underpinnings and practical applications. I'm particularly interested in the applications and implementation, how we frame remits, how we actually do the work of citizens' assemblies and other types of processes. And lately we have been exploring and experimenting with a range of digital engagement tools that I'd like to think can engage a broader audience than we can convene in these smaller assemblies. John, you've proposed to build a suite of software and tools that engage citizens in budgeting, agenda setting, and policymaking, which you've referred to as the democracy machine. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. The phrase democracy machine is meant to sound quite silly, just to sort of get our imagination going about what are the range of things we could do that are more digital. We think of them as technological, that could repair some of the relationship between office holders and their constituents, and honestly repair the relationships among the residents of a community itself, who have been polarized for various reasons. When you look at the successes of so many online applications, from social media to games, there are lessons to be learned from those about how to bring people together, how to take people with disparate activities and interests and make them all become part of something larger than themselves. It's been very rewarding for people. That's one of the reasons we spend so much time on our phones. What we haven't done is learned the lessons from those technologies and applied them in a political and civic context. So I think the pieces of this machine are floating about, being used for different things. Some have civic purposes, most don't. But the idea of assembling those and systematically, in an evidence-based way, looking at what works, I think we could make a lot of progress towards improving the way governments, at a minimum, consult the public, but I think ultimately of drawing the public in to play a more direct role in helping to shape policy in the long run.
That's great. I know you have some thoughts on the possible barriers to these processes working. When you talk about using online tools and how they're mostly used now, they're not joining people together. They're really dividing them and putting people in echo chambers. As one of those barriers, how do you see overcoming that one with these?
I'll give you an example. So with a colleague in Italy, Andrea Felicetti, we've got a new essay we've just written about creating what we call a personalized voting guide. So imagine that you live in a community with 1,000 people, and they're all going to vote. Let's say it's a proportional representation system. And the question before them is, which political party will best serve my interests? Now, a lot of voters could really benefit from some kind of a voting guide. They don't know the answer to that question, and that's obviously who a voting guide is for. So if the thousands of people in this community were to all somehow magically get together and write a voter guide, it would be kind of watered down, a little bit incoherent, because they have so many different perspectives, different values and priorities. But imagine that we let them all just run free and write guides for separate communities, different interest groups and so on within that 1,000. You might think, well, that's sort of pointless. It would just reproduce the party structure, but not necessarily. If let's say I'm a libertarian, and I can look at the numbers and say, you know what, honestly, there's only about 3% of the public that would agree with me. I could write a voting guide to make sure the 3% of us all agree and we all vote for the same party and the same things. Or I wonder if we could make our voting guide more appealing. I wonder if we could get together with this other group almost form sort of a voting guide coalition. And let's work together. Now let's find out some things we can agree on, some principles and so on. All right, now I'm up to 6%. That's not very satisfying. One of the things we were told in the last election was that nobody believes us. Like we say things are true and they think, well, why should we believe you? Let's go ahead and turn on the feature in this online process that lets our voting guide be fact-checked. All right, now we're going to take out of the voting guide anything that doesn't pass muster with a fact check, which is a coalition of journalists and librarians that actually have some credibility still, miraculously. All right, now the point is you're putting incentives in front of a person who represents a very small part of that community to broaden their reach, broaden their appeal, and moderate probably some of their preferences. Now, all of a sudden, they're becoming politically relevant. And they're writing a guide that is broadly factually accurate, pretty clear about its value commitments. Now, that's just a metaphor at this point, but we think it's something that could be potentially viable. And I think it teaches a bigger lesson about, just as in politics, you need to build coalitions, so could it be with members of a community, that you just give people a good reason to reach across the fence and recognize that you can't do much by yourself, but there's lots of people like you, and you could band together and do something you could all live with. And then pretty soon you're building more than a majority, you're building a supermajority, and you're starting to feel good about where you live and how people treat each other. That's kind of the magic of these cooperative activities, which have worked in other contexts that you'd think the most divided places in the world, but really, when you can get people together, give them a common interest and the right incentives, you can get a lot of cooperation and you can really diminish that sort of adversarial hate that we're seeing so much around the world, including in my own country, the United States.
Yeah, thanks for that. That touches on all of those principles of deliberation about listening to a range of perspectives and trying to find where that common ground is and reaching across. And actually, I feel like you've been almost teasing this game that, sort of incentivizing people to try to find where that is. And I know you've worked a bit on gamifying these tools too. Can you explain any of that?
Sure, absolutely. When I decided that I was going to go down this path, I was following scholars like Josh Lerner, who wrote the book Making Democracy Fun, and others who said, I think we have made democracy about sort of eating your vegetables when, we never talk about how they're prepared or what could be served with them, right? There's nothing wrong with vegetables. I love me some roasted Brussels sprouts. Just don't overcook them. Come on. It's not about the sauce. It's about okay. The point is that, we can even have fun talking about a serious subject, and it's more interesting. It's more engaging. And it's important to point out that there are two fundamentally different types of games. There are competitive games, playing Monopoly, which you might not know is a game created to actually show the evils of capitalism. But it tends to ruin families. And then there's even a game called Diplomacy is more notorious. But then there are these cooperative games where you actually have a common adversary. And you can create political games that have this same concept. An extreme version of this I actually got to pitch to a TV producer once because I got his phone number by accident, was the idea that you would set aside $1 million and you'd get a group of people together who all disagree with one another and say, you each have a cause you think it should go to. You all have to agree. If you don't agree and you only have so much time, it goes to this fellow right here. He's recently released from prison. He's been allowed to practice law again for the first time in years. And he is going to have money on retainer from this person who is now up on federal charges. Right? That's where the money's going. You have 48 hours. And again, that was meant actually as a plausible TV show, but now it's kind of a metaphorical joke, which is actually that is constantly what we're facing in government. We have to have a budget. There's a deadline for having a budget. In the United States, you might notice we can barely pass a budget. But a community isn't going to deadlock and not have a budget. But just like with participatory budgeting, one of these processes that is spread around the world that involves everyday people in budgeting, it's the same concept of we only have so much to go around, but if we don't do this process correctly, we're going to make a mess of it. So let's do the best we can to reach as broad an agreement as we can, work together. And sometimes you'll even recognize, okay, this part of the budget I want and you want that other thing. neither of us is really going to get what we want unless we combine your dog park with my skate park. And now we have something that has just enough money to be viable. So again, all these cooperative principles can work together to motivate people. There's even something called an accuracy motivation, where under the right circumstances, we don't want to be wrong. We really don't. Politicians sometimes seem to not care, but actually historically, they didn't want to be embarrassed by a fact check either. That's changed a little bit in the last few years, particularly in my country. But my point is these incentives are all around us. We want to have community. We want to be connected. We want to have achievement. We want to have knowledge. And we want our interests to be respected and our needs to be met. You pretty quickly realize in any sort of political game, no matter how abstract that metaphor is, that you're not going to win as a community unless you cooperate to some degree.
Mm. Yeah, there's another principle you're touching on that we always talk about in the beginning of any of our processes. This isn't a debate. It's not about one side winning. It's not win or lose, not a zero-sum game. But you have to be able to come up with some solutions here. Here's the information, listen to each other, and come up with something going forward that's going to benefit everyone. And you also use the term that people can live with, because when we work on these processes, we know we're not going to necessarily get to everyone agreeing, and they have to understand that you might not. We'd like you to try to get to a point where most people in the room at least can live with a solution, and we understand those outliers and what their arguments are, and that's that justification for your position. It also lends me, when you're talking about participatory budgeting, it's an example usually of one of the more empowered type of processes. How much do you think that is essential in these, especially online engagements, where people might not feel as motivated, or, is it just going to be a shouting match? How might it work in things that are slightly less of an empowerment, that their decisions are going to be taken up by someone?
Well, let's walk from one end of the spectrum to the other. So when I talk about deliberation and democracy, people are sometimes surprised that I studied the jury system for 10 years. I didn't know you were a legal scholar. I said, no, I just told you I studied democratic deliberation. You do remember that the jury is a deliberative body that serves a democrat. And people are sometimes surprised, like, well, sure, but that's just the jury. No, it's an incredibly important body. In the United States, there's something like 6 constitutionally designated offices, 2 of which are the jury, the civil and criminal. And the jury is a fully empowered body. Now, jury verdicts can be overturned, appealed. There's all sorts of things, that checks and balances and so on. But the point is, when you're one of those jurors, you are the government and you are empowered. And what I studied was a weird oddball in jury research, which is, and what does that do to you? And it turns out it makes you, for many people, a better citizen. It makes you a more consistent voter. You get more involved in community life in various ways. It's impactful. And of course it is. Because you're not the government generally, but in this special situation you are. And you can take the recent Trump trial. Those 12 people knew the stakes of what they were doing, and they knew how powerful they were. And all the evidence is they took it quite seriously, as they almost always do. So that's at one end of the spectrum. At the other far end of the spectrum is the worst kind of consultation. The decision has been made. There's mandatory public engagement. We go to the public and we tell them the decision, or even worse, we give them a brief impression that they're going to make a contribution, and then they discover that the decision was already made. Now, I used to denigrate anything towards that end of the spectrum. The word consultation made me squirm, like, oh, that's an interesting term. Isn't that just public relations? I've come around to the view that it depends on this circumstance. If we're in a situation where the government truly has not made a decision, and often this is true for agencies that have some leeway, it's frequently the case that there's internal disagreement. They can't even agree on what they're going to do, and they sometimes use this process as a way of resolving that disagreement. So in the state of New Mexico in the U.S., the Highway Department had this problem. We did a deliberative process on 3 broad options for the next 20 years. And it quickly canceled one of the 3 options, my favorite one. I facilitated all these discussions. It was clear statewide public transportation never had a chance. And then it became a debate between the other 2. And there was some division in the state, but it was very revealing the city of Albuquerque was worried about all the rural roads, and the rest of the state, which is rural, didn't care about the rural roads. They wanted better interstates because that's where they get a lot of miles logged. And so the highway department had a very clear guidance going forward what to do, improve the interstates. So that was consultation. Now, would you call that empowered? I think it's important to say it's not. But the democracy machine concept is not just about a consultation. It's about building a relationship between the residents, say, of a community and their government. And the understanding going in, there has to be a promise that we will be responsive to whatever you recommend. And we're going to be in that process. If you're coming up with crazy recommendations that we've already done studies and they're not feasible, that's on us, because we should have put that information into the process, because I know you're smart enough to care, right? But when you make the recommendations in the end, it doesn't mean the city's required to do those things you asked, but it is required to give a substantive response that when they aren't going to do what you request, explains why. The holy grail, in fact, in this field is that trust in government goes up when you're told that it will not do what you requested for a very good reason that you find compelling, right? You're almost embarrassed after the fact. But then that repeats. Now there's a little more trust in the government and a little more trust in the public. So many office holders, when they see a deliberation firsthand for the first time, are blown away. And I don't mean this to sound like, oh, rah, rah, cheer, cheer. No, they're genuinely confused or surprised, almost spooked. Like, how is this possible? What evil magic is this, right? These aren't the people who come to public meetings, right? And so on and on. You've heard it all. I see you nodding over there, right? So over time, the mutual trust builds. And in my empirical model, I believe that will lead to increasingly empowered processes, right? The government will come to trust that the public can handle a tougher question, can handle a little more authority, and that will just be iterative. They're still elected officials. They still have, degrees of authority they probably will never yield, and that's fine, really, because if the public is engaged, they're going to have an easier time doing their job well.
Yeah, that's great. I feel like we're very early on that process, and at least local and regional governments, they have a mandate to do these consultations on big decisions, but they're consultations and they're very dense, usually short time frame. They don't get the voices that will just give up about these processes and what we specifically reach out to when we do a citizens assembly or other deliberative process, and I agree, people who come, the officials who come in the room and think, oh my goodness, this actually can happen, and look at this room full of very diverse citizens who are listening to each other and listening to the evidence. And, so I do feel like it's a process that we have to keep building on and gaining that trust both ways with the public and with the governments. And let's be honest. I bet you've encountered this too. And when you say you're not that far along, as far as I can tell, you're right there with everyone else. As far as people who are really trying to push forward a more democratic, more deliberative, more engaged and inclusive kind of public decision making, there's pushback on both sides. Sometimes about the agenda. I've seen public officials broaden the scope of a consultation too much. They were never really prepared to hear recommendations and feedback on this full range of things, and so they make a mess of it. And on the other side, if they narrow it too much, there's pushback from the community. How come you didn't consider our option? We want this entirely different thing. And that requires a little bit of trust between kind of community leaders and the government, where they can scope out what is a realistic definition of the question we can put to people right now. In my highway department example, I was very proud of them. I thought they did a great job of being honest and saying, 92% of our budget or something like that is inflexible. It comes from the federal government mostly. All we can do is take this small part, stretch it out over 20 years, and now we've got a real choice. But the viable choices are really these. They actually didn't get any pushback on that. It was a pretty good framing of the particular choice where the public input could matter. And the public never pushed back on it either. They thought, okay, this is great. This is interesting, right? I had no idea that this was all we really have to play with, but let's play with it. Yeah, I think it is an eye-opener for the public, too, when they come into these processes. And they usually come out with a better view of the agency and their what they have to face, as opposed to what they start with, having an idea that we want to come into this room and just yell at these people because they're not doing what we want. And then they gain a better understanding. And I think, like you said, for the jurors, they come out differently. I think the people who are in these processes do. And so that's why I'm really, really interested in the online, how we supplement these things with online engagement to get more people doing this. And I do wonder, when you talk about that issue of you've come up with an answer, the agency or the government is going to come back with a reason why they can't do it. In some ways, ideally, all of those reasons should be in the process to begin with, and people can see what's possible, even when an option is there. Well, let's look at that, and you will know even within the process that that's not actually viable. So you ideally wouldn't come up with a solution that wouldn't work.
Absolutely. It was an Australian colleague who, in preparation for this trip, that's where I had after spending more than a couple weeks here in New Zealand, he used the phrase policy-based evidence making, which I had not yet heard, and I think I'm in a pretty cynical crowd in some ways. But that's exactly the problem with so much politics, is that people demand something. They might even manage to put something on the ballot that, if passed, can't be done, right? There was someone so cynical in the United States, in the state of Washington where I lived, he would do that deliberately to build up his political capital. Once again, the people in our state house, our court, have stolen from you people the thing you demand. Right? He knew right from the beginning that would happen. It was perfect. He would win the election, and then he would win the hearts and minds of people who felt like outsiders, right? Totally cynical politics. By contrast with this deliberation, I can even give the highway example again. I loved when someone in one of these deliberations said, we should do toll roads in New Mexico. And I thought to myself, oh my God, that's absolutely, I've been thinking this since I moved here. There's two interstates bisecting the states, perfect. And all we had to do was look at the closed circuit camera and say, well, we know the highway department's back there. Have you people studied this? If so, come join us. We're going to move on. We're going to move on to the next topic. But so 20 minutes later or something, someone from the highway department came in, sat down in a very plain folding chair, and as nerdy and frumpy as they could be, and say, yes, I agree with you. It seems intuitive that this state is perfectly situated. However, we did a 4-year feasibility study just 10 years ago, and it turns out that for every $1 we make in tolls, we would spend $1.04 on the total operation. And there was a pause, and someone, I don't remember who, someone in that group of citizens said, well, all right, that's a dumb idea. So anyway, let's talk about truck weight. Right? That was the end of that. And like you said, that's not going to be one of their recommendations. They know something they didn't know before, but they had no problem assimilating that information. Now they want to talk about the weight of trucks and how we tax, fine. Okay, good. So I can't stress this enough, though, because people will say, well, that's a funny example, but why did we waste our time on putting these people in the room with the people who knew what they were doing? Why don't you just let the guy who write the report? Well, the people who write the reports and do the research are gathering hopefully reliable, strong evidence that bears on the questions that we all face, but those questions have to have a value component, right? And that's the beauty of that New Mexico story, is that the people in the city felt sorry for everyone else, but they wanted to give them something they didn't want, right? So there was a values alignment once you got to that. But the highway department was a bunch of technical people and political people in Santa Fe, the capital, and they genuinely did not know this. And they could do survey research, and there's all sorts of ways to get the public's in. But sitting down in a room and sorting through things, learning facts, it has a powerful way of clarifying your own reasoning. And then you confront the person who has different values from you, and you start to, there's a creativity to it, a spontaneity to it. And if only we could replicate this process for everyone, right? We say that. Well, that's part of the reason we want to move online, is that the cost drops so low. You could probably save a lot of money on public engagement and consultation, yet involve a much wider swath of the public in more meaningful opportunities, which, to be clear, wouldn't be exclusively online, but even the face-to-face components would be integrated with what's happening online in ways that would be more inclusive and more robust representations of that wider public.
That's great. I hope there is hope. I have hope for that. And just we're actually over the time that I had allotted, but I knew we could talk for a long time. We are, as you've heard over the last couple of days, we would love to really get into these bigger, really crunchy issues that are national level. And this might be a curveball question, but I just wonder if you have any advice for us as we think about how we would set up a national conversation. And I'm not going to even speculate on the exact question, but even what is the Aotearoa New Zealand that we want? How do we start to think about how we would set something up like that?
My answer would be two words: focus and patience. So the front end work is, can we focus on some issue or question that maybe is a multidimensional question, but it has some specificity? These deliberative processes tend to work well when they're about something, not everything. And that's tough political work. And I've seen people avoid that work and just rush to have the deliberation, and it all falls apart because all the people who should be engaged in supporting this process get divided. So focus is one. The second one is patience. And I don't mean patience in the sense of, we should all wait our turn until the government says, well, now we'll. No, I mean patience. Wait for the right timing, the opportunity. I've even seen a situation where people had a couple things in mind, which gives them a little more freedom to find a good opportunity, because political windows open and close. There's a time right now in the United States where if you want to talk about democracy and the fundamental principles of democracy, you've got a moment. You've had one really since January 6th of 2021. So if that focus is there on something or a couple somethings, and there's a politically attuned group trying to make this happen that are patient enough to wait for the right window to open. But then I guess the third word is you got to seize that. You've got to be ready and committed and have people on board. And that's what we're going to do. And, I think to the state of Wisconsin, where a dear colleague of mine works, he really wanted to talk about the working conditions of home healthcare workers. That was not issue number one for most political organizations in Wisconsin, but he was able to articulate why that's a labor issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a race issue, it's an income inequality issue, it's about government, it's all these things, and it's something very specific that is very painful right now. People are being exploited, and the people who need these care, you can see where I'm going. But the point is that takes some vision and some creativity, and then you look for the right moment to strike. And in his case, you just try to get a law passed. In our case, we try to have the deliberation that leads to the passage of the best possible law.
That's great. I mean, that's a lot to think about as we set up something that we are calling the Koi2 Forum. We hope that it will become a space to convene these conversations. So we need to figure out where to start on those and what tools to use. And I hope we can stay in touch and talk about that later.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to visit. It's been amazing to come here to New Zealand, and the graciousness and the welcoming here is really heartfelt. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening today. To learn more about our work, including deliberative democracy and democratic innovation, please visit our website at informedfutures.org.